Hello, this is Chris Fitzgerald with a supplemental video on shell voice leading and a couple of voice leading examples. This video is sort of an addendum to part 5 of the jazz-based video technique series, and it's sort of a condensed version of the principles of voice leading, the guidelines of voice leading, a couple of written examples that are not included in the video. So to get started with, let's talk about the shell voice leading principles. As you can see on the screen, we are defining all 10th double stop voicings built up from the 4th string as type 4 voicings. All 7th double stop voicings built up from the 3rd string will be called type 3 voicings. Voice leading we are defining as movement from one chord voicing to the next with as little motion as possible. And since we only have 2 voicing types, this can be done via several really simple voice leading guidelines. And it happens in 2 steps. Step 1, identify the distance between the chord root you're currently playing and the root of the next chord in the progression. So you have to sort of randomly choose which first voicing type you're going to be using, but from then on the system will voice lead the progression for you. And step 2, based on the distance between the 2 chord roots, apply the following guidelines to determine the best voice leading. If the distance is any kind of a second that's up or down, you retain the same voicing type you're already using and shift it to the next root. You see here on the screen in example 1, the first example is of second motion, and in this example we're going from C major to D minor 7. It's a second, so we keep the same voicing type and we stay on a type 4 and from one chord to the next. This could work if it was a minor second or a major second, also whether it was ascending or descending, so we could be going from C major 7 to B flat major 7. It would still be type 4 to type 4. If the distance is any kind of third, you can either retain the same voicing type or switch to the opposite type. And either shift, physical shift, will likely be equally difficult to play. So in this example down here, we're going from C minor 7 to E flat major 7. The distance is a third, and we can either switch from type 4 to type 3, or we can stay on a type 4 and move that entire voicing up. The same thing would occur if this were a descending third. Typically, because of the voicing range aspect, which we talked about in the last video and which I'll mention here at the very end, typically when I have the interval of a third, I will usually go in whatever direction moves me higher on the fingerboard, because of the fact that voice leading always tends to lead down in this type of system. And last, if the distance is any kind of fourth, you switch from one voicing type to the opposite. So here we are, C minor 7, the next chord is an F7, so we start on a type 4, it's a fourth, so we switch, and now the F7 is a type 3. This last part of the fourth distance from one root to the next is really important, because the most common chord progression in all of jazz is the 2-5-1 progression. So it's sort of will be worth our time to take a closer look at the 2-5-1 progression. Here in this example, example 2, we have 2 different types of 2-5-1 progressions. One which starts on a type 4 and one which starts on a type 3. In any 2-5-1 progression, and really in any cycle of fourths type of progression, but especially the 2-5-1 progression, if you start on a type 4, the middle chord, the 2 chord will be a type 4, the middle chord will be the opposite type, and the 1 chord will be the same type that you started on. So in this case, we're starting on C minor 7, the distance is a fourth, we switch to an F7, a type 3 F7 chord, and then the distance from F7 to B flat is also a fourth, so we switch from a type 3 to a type 4. Here in the second example, we're starting on a type 3 chord, an F minor 7, we switch to a B flat 7 chord, which is a type 4, and then when we resolve to the 1 chord, we switch back to a type 3 and the E flat major 7. So this basically sums up our voice leading principles. There's one other aspect which was discussed in the video, and that is that there's a range component to all of this. Since voice leading always leads down, then what we will want to do is to set a bottom voicing range for each type of voicing. And in the previous video we discussed for type 4 voicings, because of the wider interval, we'll take those all the way down to G on the 4th string. For type 3 voicings, which is a 7th rather than a 10th, and a slightly narrower interval which can't really go quite as low, we'll take those down to D on the third string, which is a slightly higher space on the fingerboard. Okay, moving on. There are two musical examples which are more sort of what you would likely encounter in a real musical situation than were shown in the last video. The first is the accompaniment track to the introduction to the voice leading video itself. It's Fly Me to the Moon. If you remember the video, there were two screenshots on the introduction. One was of the introduction being played on the left in double stop voicings, and on the right hand side of the screen there was a solo track. So this is actually the musical example, a transcription of the accompanying track from that video. So before I start talking about it, I'm just going to go ahead and play the music along with it and scroll on the screen so you can watch it go by, and then we'll come back and talk about some of the more interesting details involved in this one. This is a transcription of the introduction of Fly Me to the Moon. Okay, so in that example, you notice there are a lot of embellishing chords that were not in the previous video. So talking through it, most of what you see is a cycle of fourth progressions, so we should be switching voicing types every time we see that. A minor to D minor, switch, D minor to G7, switch. Normally from this G7 to C we would switch, but because we're at the bottom of our voicing range here with a type 4 voicing on a low G, we went ahead and broke the voice leading rule and moved up to another type 4 voicing to the C to give us room to fall back down again. Next chord from C to F is a fourth, so we switch to a type 3. To B, augmented fourth, so we switch to a type 4, B to F. And this is a chord that was not really in the original progression. It's a tritone sub to the E7, an embellishing chord basically. So we switch from the type 4 to the type 3. We stayed on a type 3 because F to E is a second. E to B flat is an augmented fourth, so we switch from type 3 to type 4. B flat to A, again this is another tritone sub, is a second, so we stayed on the type 4. A minor to E flat 7 is an augmented fourth or diminished fifth, however you want to look at it. Switch to type 3. E flat to D, second, so we stay on the type 3. D to A flat, another tritone sub leading to the G. D to A flat is an augmented fourth, so we switch to a type 4. A flat to G is a second, so we stay on a type 4. E minor, G to E minor. Here we could have gone either way, but if we had gone down, if we had stayed on a type 4 from this G7 to this E minor, we would end up with just the open strings. So instead decided to move up to the E minor as a type 3, moving to an A7, which is a fourth, switch to a type 4, and here there are three passing chords: A7, B minor, B sharp minor, C sharp minor, and that's just basically a walk up. So all of these would be the interval of a second, either major or minor. In this case it's chromatic in the middle of this progression, and so we stay on the type 4, we walk up to the D, and then when we finally move to the G7, it changes to a type 3. Here's another tritone sub, D flat 7 going to C major. G to D flat 7 is an augmented fourth, so we switch to a type 4. We stay on the type 4 through the B half diminished, and from B to E is a fourth, so we switch to a type 3. Okay. On the next page, we're at A minor, we switch to a type 4, and we've got this little passing chord here, which is a second, so we stay on a type 4, another tritone sub, switch to a type 3. This interval is a second. Stay on the type 3. And then we've got another tritone sub leading to the G. Interval is an augmented fourth, so we switch to a type 4. Now we're on the G, type 4. We have another walk up. This time it's a double walk up. And since all of these root motions are seconds, we're going to just stay on type 4 all the way. G, A sharp, B, C, D, D sharp, E. And now we're up to an F major 7. Because E to F is a second, we're staying on that type 4 voicing. But notice here, this is a voicing we have not yet encountered in this example. And normally it would be a little higher than I would like to go. The only reason I think that I decided to go there was because of the walk-up. It didn't make sense to change voicing type since everything was a second. So we're on this F major as a type 4. Now we switch to the B half diminished as a type 3. Remember, that had been a type 4 earlier. But because of where we ended up in this high end of the range, we ended up on a higher version of all of these voicings. And really, the only limit to the high end of the range of your double stop voicings is what you are physically comfortable playing. So we're on a type 3 B half diminished, moving to a type 4 E7, moving to a type 3 A minor. Again, earlier this was a lower voicing, but because of where this part of the example got to because of the double walk up, we're in a higher range. So A going to E flat, another tritone sub, switch from a type 3 to a type 4, and then D minor going to G7. Again, we're in that higher range of the bass than before. Going to the G7 is a type 3, and now we have a sort of chromatic walk up to the E minor, switching to a type 4, going to an A7, again a high A7, switching to a type 3, A to E flat, augmented fourth, switch to a type 4, back to D minor. Let me straighten out the screen here a little bit. Back to D minor. Going to A flat 7, another tritone sub to the G, D to A flat, augmented fourth, so we switch to a type 3. This is a second. We stay on the type 3, G to D flat, augmented fourth, switch. D flat to C is a second, so we stay on the type 4. And then C to B is a second, so we switch, we stay on the same voicing type. We were on a type 4, we stay on a type 4. B to E is a fourth, so we switch to a type 3, and E to A is a fourth, so we switch to the type 4 again. And notice that at this point we are back in the normal range, sort of in the middle of the bass neck, which is a much more common range for playing these double stop voicings. The next example is a really short one, but I thought to include it because it's the introduction to all of the videos in the series. It's the duet recording of just bass and clarinet with myself and David Klingman, great clarinet player. And we recorded this years before we ever thought of, before I ever thought of doing any sort of video series, or certainly anything to do with double stops. But it shows how double stops can be a normal part of duo or trio playing in the absence of a chordal instrument especially. It also is a good example of how double stops don't always have to be played as simultaneous sounding notes. They can be broken and played melodically but sustained, so that you end up with a double stop in sustain, but without actually attacking it as a double stop. So before I play this one, it's a really short example. It's only the part of the tune which gets included in the introduction to all the videos. So before I talk about this one, I'm going to go ahead and simply play the music so that you can hear and watch the transcription as it goes along, and then I'll come back and discuss it briefly. Okay, getting back to the beginning of this example, obviously the introduction itself is just a regular sort of two-feel bass line, setting up a vamp sort of groove, setting up F minor, waiting for the melody to come in. And there's nothing to do with double stops there at all. Once the tune starts, the clarinet enters with the melody over the vamp, or over the groove, I should say, which continues at much as a normal two-feel groove bass line would, going through the changes: F minor, D half diminished, D flat 7, C7 flat 9, back to F minor. And it's on the second 4 bars of the tune where the double stops begin. Here, instead of attacking the double stop as two simultaneous sounding notes, the low G flat is played going to the high B flat. And notice this is 1/2 step lower than we just said was normal for voicing range. In this case, I made an exception just because I was there and I wanted to initiate the double stops. I really wasn't thinking about it. It is a little bit more difficult to intonate than the G, but you know, sometimes music calls for things which are outside of a system which you may have predetermined. Here, going to the D flat 7, I wanted to move the voicings up higher, so I actually moved up an entire fifth. And that's probably why on the recording you hear the slides, so that I could tell when to stop. That kind of shift is very difficult with a single note, let alone with double stops. But anyway, normally we would have switched from a type 4 to a type 3 because of the distance, but because of the voicing range, decided to break the range, moved up to a D flat 7 and just sustained that for a while. Going to the G half diminished. In this case, D flat to G half diminished is an augmented fourth, so we switched to a type 3, going to a C7 flat 9, switched to a type 4, and then going to the F minor 7, type 3. And this is just a walk down of seconds: F minor 7, E minor 7, E flat minor 7. And all of these, because the distance is a second, we retain the same voicing type, type 3, resolved to an A flat major 7 or an A flat 7, either one. But the interval is a major 10th. So switch to a type 4 from E flat minor to A flat, and then A flat to D flat is a fourth. And here again, normally we would have switched types, but moved back up in order to get some more range to allow the voicing to speak better, to a D flat 7, and then a little sort of neighbor chord, a C7 half step, kept the same type: D flat to C, back to D flat, back to C, back to D flat, all type 4 voicings. And then for the end of the phrase, just walk down with a regular sort of broken time bass line and then set up the groove for the next A section. So there's a couple of examples of how double stops might be used in an actual musical, real-life musical situation, and a review of the basic voice leading principles and rules that were used to play in this way. Stay tuned for future videos, and thanks for tuning in.